something I've wanted to do for a long time is try to do. It's not going to be weekly, maybe twice a month. Come on here, and I always thought do something with the 54. The 54 minutes works pretty good. And the first person I thought of was my buddy Kyle. I'm sure my audience is going to need no introduction to who Kyle is, but the premise of what I want to do with this, Kyle, and for those that will be watching, is I want to touch on topics that sometimes don't get talked about enough publicly. And I want to reach out to people in different corners of the musky world and get their take on stuff on why was last year so tough, why, what's the thought on it. So those are the kind of things I do want to touch on when I do talk to different people. But again, the first person I thought of was Kyle. Kyle and I talk a lot, probably more than we probably should. And it's we're like-minded souls in a lot of ways, but I do want to say one thing right off the get-go for those that will be watching. Kyle and I don't agree on everything. And you put it perfectly last time, Kyle. It's like we have to agree to disagree on certain things. And I think that's the sign of a good friendship. David and I are like that. We agree to disagree on certain things. So without further ado, everybody, welcome to 54 Minutes with Kyle Friedges from Cabbage. Whoa, no, not Cabbage Dragon Media. It is Beyond the 8 now. And before you say anything, Kyle, I'm going to start a timer. So the premise of the show is I want to do it for 54 minutes. So I'm going to start a timer. We're going to see if we can keep it inside 54 minutes. And there you go, Kyle. You're live.
Yeah, I appreciate the intro there, Glenn. Yeah, for those who don't know me, my name is Kyle Friedges. I'm based out of kind of the Twin Cities metro area in Minnesota, and have been musky fishing for a number of years. And over the course of the last, started filming some of those trips that I go on. Primarily, my trip up to Eagle Lake in Glenn's neck of the woods, up on the Canadian Shield, and putting out some content for that on YouTube a little bit. And as Glenn alluded to, our channel was previously named Cabbage Dragon Media, and we recently did a rebrand to Beyond the 8. Rolls off the tongue a little bit easier, and is a little bit more, I guess, marketable in terms of wearables and stuff like that, and I think relatable to folks in kind of the musky industry, because the premise behind it is really, like, none of us are just one thing in the outdoor community. I like to hunt. As you can tell, I'm wearing a blaze orange hat. We had Minnesota rifle opener last weekend. So I'm not just a musky angler, right? And that's kind of the premise behind Beyond the 8, is we're more than just one thing. So thought process being to be a little bit more relatable to kind of the community that we're building. We're building a really great community full of like-minded people. I'm sure a lot of that is stemmed off the 54 bus community as well. And I'm appreciative of that for sure. And we kind of just want to keep it rolling here and see where this goes.
I thought when you had first told me long before you went public on the rebrand, I thought it was really cool because I like that idea of including more into it. I kind of pigeonholed myself into musky fishing with the 54-inch thing, with the logo. That was always the idea behind what we were going to do. Maybe we'll throw a few things in here or there. I see SG Angling's watching, and I see James is watching. Hey there, guys. But what really drew me to your content outside of the Eagle Lake stuff, and we're going to touch on the Eagle Lake stuff because Eagle Lake comes up so much in musky related YouTube content. But when I started following your stuff and I seen some of the other things that you guys had on there, it was really interesting. And I've always been a big fan of what you guys have been doing. I don't hide that. I try to promote you guys. I really love that that adventure aspect and the realism in it. And authentic is a kind of a shitty overused word today in YouTube and a lot of content creation, because we're all trying to do something with what we're doing. But you guys come across as very genuine. You really like what it is you guys are doing, and you can see that. And I feel like David and I and my other core group of us, we try to do something very similar and show that passion through it more than I'm not looking for likes, I'm not looking for subs. That's great, but you alluded to community, and that's what this type of show is going to be about. It's going to be about community building and that like-mindedness.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I kind of appreciate that perspective. We certainly never set out on this with the premise of, getting famous on YouTube or anything like that. Like, that's never been my intention. If you guys have ever listened to the Musky Hunks podcast or Muskies on Tap or some of these others that I've been on, it's been like, these trips are special to me. Going up to Eagle is a special place. It means a lot to me every year that I'm fortunate to be able to go and do that, and we're so blessed to be able to do that. And I want to document it, and I want to be able to go back and watch it, because as soon as I leave Eagle, I'm looking forward to the next trip. And I think some of the authenticity comes from, just like, I'm not an expert, right? Like, I'm not a pro angler. We're learning through the process, and each of these moments is exciting and new to us. And we're trying to get better every time we're out on the water. And it's like the moments you see in the boat are what's actually happening. And kind of who I am as a person is who you're getting right now and who you get in the videos. And we just um, as you kind of alluded to too, Glenn, like, you guys are fortunate to be up in that area. The waters that I fish locally, I don't really have that same opportunity to tell stories quite as well. And quite honestly, like, there's so much pressure that goes on in a lot of the lakes I fish that I don't want to exploit it more than I need to anyway. Um, so that Eagle Lake trip is really one that is fits well with our style in terms of opportunity to kind of tell that story, the travel up there, the prep leading up to the trip, figuring it out, right? You get to a body of water, and you haven't been on it all year. And like, yeah, you may give me some tips on what you've heard from others, what you've experienced out on it. But for the most part, like, it's like, you got to figure it out. It's like fishing a tournament. Like, the first 2 days up on Eagle every year on a week long trip are pre-fishing, basically, to figure out what the fish are doing so that you can have success the rest of the trip. And, that's the reality of those trips. And that's what we try to document and keep it, I guess, authentic, to use your word.
Yeah, no, and I think that that comes across, and something that I've seen in a lot of other channels is that journey. And Sam was on here, and Sam had those really couple cool videos from Eagle this year that you and I've talked about. I talked about with Sam. So we're talking about SG angling, and his videos were relatable because they talked about the history there with his family, very similar to yours. You have that history coming up here with your family. It's different for me because Eagle Lake's 5-10 minutes away. I can be fishing with Hunter at Temple Bay in 15 minutes. So there's no journey for me. It's just jump in the truck and go. So it's hard for us to relate that story. But watching your content and seeing others mimic or pick up on that style, and it's something that's happening across YouTube, and the creator market is growing. There's no doubt. Kyle and I talk about it all the time when we're just chatting on the phone or we're texting back and forth, that everybody's got a YouTube channel, whether it's musky related or any kind of outdoor sport. And while that's good, there's a lot of saturation to it, and there's a lot that you see the same things happen over and over again. And I've seen from a couple other people that are trying to do that similar style of video that you're doing. Now, you're not the first that ever did that neither. You've taken some inspiration from guys like Jay Siemens, who's probably the benchmark for that style of video. And there's others that have done stuff similar. Even like Brian Scaife, he never made it about the journey to Eagle Lake, but like, let's face it, a big chunk of why Brian is where Brian is with Angling Anarchy is because he came to Eagle Lake, and there's that destination to it. And that's what drew me to somebody like Brian. And I love Brian. I think his stuff's amazing. And he's one of the OGs of that style of content. So we all take inspiration from that. But it just, watching where you're taking your stuff and where I'm trying to take our stuff, and not just be, here's the catch, here's what it is we did. we're trying to teach and do a little bit more. And again, I'm like, yeah, I've never claimed to be the best angler. Like any given day I'm out in Northwestern Ontario, I'm average at best. And we get lucky just like everybody else. We grind it out. And you're going to have shitty days. There's just no two ways about it. But you try to do more than just that catch fest style of video, which I think, it's kind of been overexploited. And that's something that you and I talk about a lot.
And YouTube is obviously saturated with musky content now. And like my biggest piece of advice to somebody, it's funny, I had written down a couple questions, you too, if we had time, but like one of the questions was going to be like, if you were going to give advice to somebody who's getting into this, like what would be that one piece of advice? And from my perspective, it's, be out, or Brian Scaife, as you mentioned, has done Eagle Lake for years and years and years and years, and people could look at my stuff and say, well, he's just trying to be the next Brian or whatever. Put your own authentic spin on it. I mean, at the end of the day, like releasing a video on YouTube is a form of art, and it allows you to express your own brand of creativity. And while you can take inspiration from others, like copycatting isn't going to get you anywhere. And folks that watch a 54 bus, or watch a Brian Scaife, or watch a Jay Siemens, or watch a Doug Wegner as an example, they're going to recognize what you're doing pretty quickly. And even it comes down to like the music. If you're just pulling music off somebody else's stuff, it's folks will realize that. So, I mean, I think maintaining some level of authenticity and having your own creative spirit to your videos is going to make you stand out, and make you people will pick up on that pretty quickly. And, you know, like I've always said, like being able to go back and watch my Lake of the Woods trip from last year, this Eagle Lake series that I'll release over the next several months from this year, like that's worth more than any dime, any pro staff deal, anything I could ever make off the fishing industry. Like that's so unimportant to me compared to having that documented and being able to go back and watch it again and again and connect with people too. Like we got people commenting here. Like I see Sam and Max and a few others on here. Like that's what it's all about, right? Building those friendships, building community, and you know, I guess just enjoying the whole journey, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I I think I learned early on that I was never going to be Doug Wagner, and like he's an amazing fisherman. You can't take nothing from him, and the style of video that he does. I was never going to be Brian Scaife. I was never going to be an Eagle Lake specialist. We had to find our own spot inside of that and try and figure out what was going to connect with the community I wanted to build. And I've never tried to tell anybody that we were all about only big fish, or we were all about only catching tigers, or we were all about like Eagle Lake. It was always about the area and doing as much to promote the area as we can and try and be consistent in our message. And I think going back to what you said, and the premise of this whole live that I want to do is I want to touch on some of these issues because I think there's so many people that get into musky fishing in general and then into YouTube or content creation for the wrong reasons. They want to be famous for that grip and grin picture. They want to be famous for whatever it is. And I just think that like you, that's the wrong reasons for a lot of reasons. And when you look at, you mentioned pro staff, you mentioned, the deals that a guy gets, and those companies know who brings value to those companies. Like they watch everything that goes on. They understand the people that bring the most value to whatever company that they're doing. And that whole pro staff thing gets so saturated down with companies wanting to have 50 people promoting their stuff and they just don't have a dedicated message on one. And you look at a company like Thorne Brothers, and you think of Thorne Brothers, and Doug Wagner runs their rods. Like, there's no denying he's the face of Thorne Brothers rods. And you look at some of these other companies, and you're not really sure who that one guy is. And it's not a fault of any of the companies. We're just so saturated as an industry that I think we need to look at ways to, yes, bring new people in because new people buy the products from these companies, but we also need to make it so that when you do have a quote unquote pro staff deal, it's something exclusive. It means something more than just everybody gets a 50% off deal. And the flip side of that is there's so many basement builders these days that they build a handful of baits and then they got a pro staff team, and that again, that just kind of, it simplifies it down to like, is everybody in the musky industry pro staff? Like, is that what we want? I know that's kind of a little bit of a tangent where we are going. I want to circle back around to Eagle Lake right away here, but like, what's your thoughts on that kind of stuff, Kyle? And I see Mitch is on there. Hey, Mitch, nice to see you joined us.
as well. So it's a little bit easier, but there's opportunities to build a name for yourself pretty quickly when the industry's small. And coupled with that, I mean, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? Like, obviously, Doug has made a unbelievable name for himself, maybe the best muskie else, right? Because Doug's going to sell those rods for him. But then you look at some of these other companies that are trying to maybe make a name for themselves or refresh their brand, or a little bit different in terms of where they are, as an example. And they may be the kind of company that's going to give somebody like me or somebody else kind of their first real pro staff opportunity. And so you look at it on both ends of the spectrum, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. But yeah, I think there's a fine line between, maybe oversaturation and what's a good balance and a healthy balance to maintain some semblance of exclusivity on your pro staff, and determine like who's actually bringing value, like what's actually driving that value. And that changes by the month in the social media world that is driving all of this. Like, in a minute, less than 30 seconds, less than 20 seconds has become ever more in terms of getting in front. Interesting dichotomy we have because we're such a small industry where a lot of folks get their starts with some of those companies that maybe have a higher volume of pro staffers as they're trying to expand their reach, right, and build their brand, versus the Thorne Brothers, which is, on basically every muskie podcast. It's been all over YouTube for years. They've created a name for themselves in the Minneapolis metro. Like, that's the place to go when you need tackle and rods and other gear. So they don't need to push as much and expand their reach. So it's an interesting dichotomy that we kind of have. But yeah, people always kind of hope that once they get that pro staff deal, I think, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn, I'm not exactly sure, but that there's some level of exclusivity there, right? That it means something, that you've earned that, and that you're providing value to that brand and whatnot. And
Yeah, I think looking back at the YouTube kind of model of what it is we're doing versus the people that don't like the YouTubers. So a lot of the quote unquote pro guides are always against the YouTube community. I don't see it near as much in Canada because we don't see the pressure. If I go fish Eagle Lake every single day and I chase Danny Herbeck around and I show every spot that he fishes at, yeah, I'm going to get some backlash over that, like rightfully so. But I don't, we don't name lakes when we go fishing other than Eagle Lake because Eagle Lake is a big draw. And that's one reason why people find your videos, find Brian Skate's videos. They're finding Sam's videos from SG Angling because it says Eagle Lake on it. But back to the conventional musky industry thought of the guides are the one that promote all the gear versus the YouTubers who are there's so many names that they call us, the joke tubers, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, there is some spot burning for sure that happens in a lot of those spots down in the States. And again, I don't live there. I don't see the pressure that you guys have to deal with. So it's slightly different here. But for us here, I'm trying to go out, fish these lakes, promote them and the area as much as I can because we want to get the tourists. I want to have more people musky fishing. I'm not out there trying to hurt Danny Herbeck's livelihood as a professional guide. And I would never be able to do that because I'm just not the angler that he is. And I know that. But when I look at guys on that St. Clair, the Green Bay, some of those Great Lake areas that are so anti video, a lot of them, I think, forget that they were on Muskie Hunter with Jim Sarek. They were on some of those early TV shows that helped promote them in a big way. And our mutual friend, Kevin Wagner, had told me a long time ago, he's like, and this is not a knock on guides. I do some guiding on the side. A lot of my friends are full-time guides. Tremendous amount of respect for those guys that can go out there every single day and pound the water. I had nothing but respect for them. I couldn't do it, but when a guide is out every day for a couple hundred days of the year, he's got two people in the boat, he's maybe getting products in front of 400 people, add in his social media, whatever he might have. You post one video from Eagle Lake and you caught that first fish on that Hunsey tail, and you're sitting at 2,000 views or 2,500, whatever you're at right now, Kyle. That's 2,500 sets of eyes that seen that lure. There's guides that will take years to get that lure in front of that many people. And again, that's not a knock on the guide model. I just think that the way that companies promote stuff has changed so much in the past few years, and the value of good social media. And look at a few years ago when Ben Stone caught that crazy figure eight fish. That's all anybody talked about for probably a month, that video, and what was he using, what was the rod, what was the situation. It opens up this dialogue and everybody wants to know how that happened and what happened around that. If he was a guide, hypothetically speaking, and he didn't have any video of that, that's just a story. It's just hearsay. Honestly, nobody cares about that situation. And there's companies now like Jesse Baker's out there, social. They look at social media as more of a storytelling avenue. So it's always about what's the story behind the picture or that short video or whatever it is that you're promoting. And that, back to what you guys are doing. I love the storytelling aspect of your content, and even just a picture, you put a picture up and there's a story to it. To me, that's what's going to separate the next generation of musky anglers, because like there's guys down in Minnesota that are just slamming huge fish. We could go into the forward facing sonar. That's not for today. But what's the story behind those fish? It's a negative story more than a positive story. And I want to see some positivity from the musky industry and not all the drama. And again, that's what this series is going to be about. I want to touch on some of this freaking drama that we just deal with day in and day out, for sometimes for no reason at all, because it's two groups fighting all the time. And I know you and I have talked, Kyle, about when you were doing this but you weren't as connected with some of these companies, you didn't see that drama behind the scenes, and now you're starting to see it.
Yeah, I think, maybe first I'll just touch on the guide versus YouTuber form of marketing, if you want to call us YouTubers, content creators, whatever the fancy buzzword is this week. But there's two different probably schools of thought on that, right? Like the YouTuber can reach a broader audience through content creation, and in theory, you don't need somebody with as big of a name, right? So it's a cheaper form for these companies to get the exposure. And it only takes one video, a la the Benstone figure eight fish from Mille Lacs. It only takes one video for somebody who doesn't have much of a following to get a lot of views, right? So it's easy to get that exposure from these companies going that route. Now, on the guide side, where there's value there for these companies is that equipment's tried and tested, right? Every day on the water, you have inexperienced anglers who are hard on gear, and we all know that.
Yep.
When I first started sport, like I was smashing leaders into rod tips and doing all sorts of stuff that was just tough on equipment, engaging reels on casts, and there's some form things you can do there to avoid that. But where the guides have the advantage is it's a reputable name that can speak to the longevity of the equipment and the quality of the equipment. So I think for companies, there's a happy blend there between both of those forms of marketing and promotion. On the drama side, I mean, I've already alluded to it's a small industry. Like you're going to run into that. I think in an industry of this size, and there's a lot of personalities and there's a lot of folks that have been in a really long time and deserve a ton of respect. And sometimes they don't always get that respect, and it leads to those sorts of situations. And I personally just try to stay out of it as much as possible. And again, what we're trying to do here, like whether it's through promoting the Musky Battle, which is such a positive event, or just dropping videos on our channel that kind of shows the growth and trajectory of us as anglers in this sport. Like we're just trying to highlight the positive stuff, right? Good handling practices, using proper equipment. I want to touch on a lot more of that in this Eagle Lake series. It's hard when you're up there in the heat of the moment. You've been grinding all day. You finally get a fish. It's hard to connect the story. So I'll probably piece in talking segments from back home, similar to what you do, where you go back to the man cave and all that, and try and promote more of that positivity. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to, be good people, be respectable, and try and be a good role model. Because even if you don't think you have a presence, you do. People know who you are in this industry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that positive messaging, it it does need to be, kind of reaffirmed every time we're out doing something, because it only takes one bad thing and then that's the talk of the industry again. So it's always positive to try and just keep talking about those really fundamental things, because we have so many new anglers coming in, and I see it on my channel. I get so many comments of, hey, we're learning a lot of the stuff that you guys are showing. We're able to try and take a lot of that and put it into practice. So I appreciate that from our viewers. And again, that's the the community building side of it that what that we're trying to do with 54 Bust. And you know, looking at your Eagle trip this year, Kyle, and I know a lot of the story, but the viewers don't, and we're not going to give any kind of spoilers away because I want your videos to stand alone on their own. But what were the changes you seen this year, positive and negative? And I will just give one disclaimer that when you came up here, it was really tough fishing and a lot of guys were struggling, me included. I give you my idea of what I thought you might see as a pattern, and you basically rewrote the script on what was going to happen in those 2 weeks. So just kind of talk us through that Eagle Lake trip and what you seen on the water. And I want you to mention the incident you had with that boat, because I do think that's something that's very important from an etiquette kind of standpoint.
Hmm. Well, here's what I'll tell you. The pre-pandemic, when I would go up in the fall from 2016 to 2019-ish, we were in camp boats. We didn't have trolling motors. We didn't have depth finders. And quite honestly, 2016 marked the first year where I went from going up in the spring to fish walleyes around opener, where they're obviously in the shallow bays and it's easy to catch them, right? You're not really paying attention to underwater structure and things muskies would relate to, right? So the first 15 or so years I went up to Eagle, that was the big thing. And then with camp boats, it was a lot of like, we're gonna have to wind drift because we don't have a trolling motor, we don't have a depth finder, and a lot of that was centered around like finding mid lake rocks and islands and focus versus, where's the weed edge that I can see on my electronics, but I can't visibly see. What's the depth doing? Where's the drop offs? Where are the inside turns? Where's the underwater rock extensions that would potentially hold fish? So it was not a ton of learning. It was more luck than anything. Like, honestly, when I look back on that, I can't believe we even caught fish like we did. And then when we went up post pandemic, it was the first time I had my own boat. So learning the electronics, learning how the lake mapped out, using AutoChart as a tool was like the best thing that ever could have happened to me up there. What I thought I knew about the lake, it was like a slap in the face. Like, no, you don't know what plays out down there. You haven't had this intel before. So I would define this year as an accumulation of the prior 2 years, figuring out the underwater nuances that I would have never known about before. So I would call it compounding growth in terms of like, I'm just starting to figure it out and things are starting to click. And when I see this sort of rock, that's all of a sudden when I see muskies, and when I'm seeing different forms of rock, I'm not seeing them. That's really what started to click this year. The other thing I will tell you is the prior 2 years, 2 or 3 years, we had low water when I went up in August. And this year we didn't. It was normal water levels. And with the lack of snowfall and cold weather we had over the winter, the weeds were unbelievable, like absolutely unbelievable in some of the spots. And what I figured out on, I think it was the first full day. So I fished the half day that I got up there. First full day was like, that's where they were. And I've heard a lot of people talk about, maybe the fish never quite got out of the spawn funk this year or whatnot. I think what really happened, Glenn, is for 3-4 years there, everybody was hitting deep rocks because the water was different. And it was the first year we had good weeds, and like the fish were in the weeds. And if you weren't seeing them in the weeds, it's because it was the wrong bait presented to them. And that's what I figured out pretty quickly. And quite honestly, the story of our trip was the 7/8 Huntsy tail banger, unbelievable bait. Can't wait to pick up a bunch more at the Wausau show this year. And a 10-inch weighted wood Suick that I would modify slightly depending on conditions and form of structure. And I can guarantee you there was nobody else on that lake throwing those baits. I when I'm up there, it's bulldogs, it's cowgirls, it's topwater, it's all of the Canadian Shield staples you see everybody throwing, spinner baits to a certain degree. And I never see anybody throwing wood, and I never see anybody throwing crankbaits and small blades for that matter, really, when I'm up there. So it was kind of one of those things where it was like, I wanted to think outside the box a little bit, where the small blade came in handy as I could navigate it through the cabbage a lot better than I could a bigger blade with, blades that were expanding much further. I could navigate that small blade through there, and then the Suick, you can kind of work it through. And that Huntsy tail banger was 100% the key to our success. We should have had probably another 6 fish on it over the course of the trip. I'm not actually sure how many we ended up with over the course of the 2 weeks I was up there. I know we averaged at least one a day, but I lost track around 12 fish or so on the trip, and that would have been on like the Tuesday of the second week. So I know we're up there where I'll be able to do a lot with the video series, but kind of explaining, like I alluded to here, like the Huntsy tail banger was used specifically in a certain application because it was the best tool for the job. And I probably could have got it done with spinner baits, but those fish have seen a million spinner baits up there. They've never seen a banger. So it was one of those things where it was like the cards kind of aligned in terms of right tool for the right job, and the fish haven't seen it, and they're all fired up, and nobody's touching these fish because everybody is fishing rocks because it was flat, calm, and bluebird, and everybody's fishing super deep because that's what we've done the last 2 to 3 years, and that's just not where they were. They were in the weeds, and it was one of those things where it was just like right place, right time. It all kind of clicked. 2 years of like compounding information. One of the things I really tried to do early on in this trip was break down water. I think I dropped 800 waypoints when I was up there, and that was weed edges, specific rock structures, items that would be hittable, like shallow and stuff like that, right? And just really laid it out so that like when I'm positioning the boat, I could fish it super effectively. And those are all things that time with your electronics will teach you some of that. And maybe that's something I probably should have done a better job of documenting, like the why behind some of that in some of these videos. And maybe it's something I'll do next year. But that's really what led to success, was kind of thinking outside the box, doing the opposite of what everyone was doing, and then just having the right tools at the right time. It just clicked.
Yeah, and I think that's always something Dave and I look at when we're going to Cedar, we're going to Indian Lake Chain Canyon, wherever it is we're going. We're like, okay, what would the patterns be? Let's start there because we're just weekend anglers. So like we don't have a week long pattern to go off of. If we go to Cedar on a Saturday on changeover day, we're gonna have the lake to ourselves till about 5 o'clock in the evening. We got to hit our A spots. And then because those fish have been pounded all week, we might have to adjust, go to the B spots or the B plus spots. So we kind of do the same thing. But to circle back to what you had said there, after you had had the success with those little blades, I reached in the tackle box and I dug out an Angling Revolution, the one that Josh had made up for me 2 years ago, with a bigger set of blades, which ultimately ended up being his newer, bigger model. I think it's double nines or a 910. I'm not even sure. I added a little dangle blade on it. I bent the wire at the tie-in. It grinds like crazy. And I was out with Hunter and we were pounding weeds and we were seeing fish in the weeds, pretty predictable spots. In the one spot we had seen this mid 40s fish pretty much all summer. It would kind of show, but wouldn't commit. I went in and able to get that blade through the weeds, got a really nice fish. We didn't bump it. It was like 46-ish, but real big fat Eagle Lake fish, the kind that people come up for. And then a few weeks later, we were out and I was using a Suick over not deep rocks, but the long extended spine of rocks off an island, so far out from the island that most people would have stopped casting that far out. And we had 4 fish moving on a day that we seen almost nothing. And we were all the way down to Nivens, all the way back up to Temple Bay. And again, we got a nice mid 40s fish on a day where it would have been easy to just go to the bar and drink beer. And then to circle back to all the weeds you were seeing, especially in Portage Bay, I was in there in October and I know I'd sent you some pictures because I was like on the water. I'm like, hey, do you recognize this spot? And we had caught a fish on that deep breaking weed line, the north end of Portage. I got it on a pit bull. But again, those fish were still holding up in those weeds in October. So it was a banner year for weeds. And one thing I'll say about Eagle Lake this year, I don't know if it's seen more pressure than normal. It seemed like it had more pressure from my perspective as somebody who just goes out there, 5, 6 times a week or a month, just primarily on the weekends. It seemed like it had more pressure. The community spots certainly had more boats on it. And there's a certain segment of guides or camp boats, of maybe it's return clientele, I don't really know, that they would circle through spots one boat after another and they wouldn't give up a spot. And I want to lead into the incident you had with one of the camp boats, because again, I think it's really important to understand as a musky angler that we can't think we own the lakes. Even though I live up here, it'd be real easy for me, and I've had some run-ins with some Americans up here that they just cut in front of me and then they yell at me like I'm a fellow American. And I'm like, no, buddy, like I live here. I'm not saying it's my lake, but I have every right to fish here as much as you do, even though you're spending $2,500 a week to fish. So there's that etiquette there that we all have to be careful of.
Yeah, I've had run-ins in the past, but the event you're specifically alluding to was in the first video I released I think it was late September. And then I put a reel on my Instagram as well. And the spot I was fishing is a spot we call 2.5 stars. That's a spot where my wife caught her fish the year prior, her upper 40s. And it was a spot where I had raised a really nice fish. And I would argue, Glenn, this is a community spot. I see a lot of
Yeah, it
guys hitting
is.
this spot. Guys know about it. So I was working through this spot and I raised the fish earlier in the spot, but she was kind of cruising a little bit when I saw her. So I thought she might push out to the deeper drop off, and there's like a rock cluster that is kind of the end of the run on this spot. And I was working through it, and I saw this boat coming from a long ways down the shoreline, and they're pretty tight to shoreline, and it's a super steep break off the shoreline. So no surprise there, right? They're just kind of cruising along, and they started getting closer, and I started thinking to myself, like, these guys they're not gonna go around me. Like they're gonna stay right between me and shore. And you'll see in the video, I make a cast, and I think I'm like 5 or 6 cranks in with a Cannonball Junior, and their boat basically just goes right past the back of it, and they literally cut between me and the shore, and I'm a cast length and a half off the shore because of how the structure lays out. Drive right over the spot, never make eye contact with me. They had their face buffs up the whole time. And that's quite a common thing with certain resorts up there on Eagle, unfortunately. The sad reality is there's like another 15 really good adjacent areas they could have just gone and fished and let me leave and fish. And Canadian Wisconsin fish will hold in the weeds regardless of how many pontoon boats buzz over their head. Minnesota fish are similar to a certain degree, but Canadian fish, in my experience, when you roll up on them, even if it's just with your trolling motor, oftentimes it'll push them off the spot, especially if they're unexpected. Now, if they've been chasing a bait and they're caught both sides, they may hang around a little bit more, but they drove right over it. They put the hammer down right on the spot and push that fish off. And, in terms of etiquette, it's so unnecessary. Like I said, there's so many adjacent areas that could have fished at that moment, allowed me to fish it through, or they could have gone to the beginning of the run and started it behind me, which was a far enough. I mean, it's a longer run. They could have started behind me, and I would have got the hint, like, okay, they want to fish through this behind me. I'll let them do it. They probably won't catch her anyway, and I'll come in behind them and catch her. And it never played out that way. They completely ruined the opportunity. They ruined their chance at the fish and forced me to go try and find something before last light, and it didn't work out. But
Yeah, and that spot, they if they're musky anglers, they would have known to go behind you to the island, and it's easy to make a run around that island. When we're coming up from the south part of the lake through that area, there's a boat there, I go around that island. I'm not gonna ruin their spot. And an interesting story there at 2.5 stars, my brother-in-law, Richie, and I were fishing it. That was quite a few years ago, and it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we raised what we thought was a 48.50 at the very start of that run at the south end. We're like, well, that's a nice fish. We're coming back here, last light, basically last cast. So on our way back in, that's where we stopped, right at the start of it. About 3 or 4 casts in, I was using a bucktail, I believe, and just doubles me up. I'm like, Richie, I got her. And like, we both look at each other like, yeah, this is going to be a good night. It comes up, it's like a 40-incher, and Richie slides the net under it. And we both look at each other. And I was like, I've never been more disappointed in my life to see a 40, because in my head, we caught that 48.50, but there was 2 fish using that. We put that one back. A few casts later, Richie had a topwater, walked the dog, and that big one come off about where you seen that boat go by. So again, it just shows that these spots are big, complex spots. They hold a lot of fish. At times, it can be 3, 4 fish using them. And you are right about that. When you put your boat on top of structure on shield lakes, we talk about it all the time on our channel. Do not start on top of structure, on top of shoreline, on top of weeds. Start out, work your way in. I see so many US anglers come up here, and a lot of them just fish shoreline, which is great. It's an easy way to learn the lake. Just grab a chunk of shoreline and cast. But when that first break is at 8 to 12, and then that second break is at 20 or 24 down to 40, you have to be out over that second break. And if you're not, you are cutting yourself short. Anybody that's fished up here knows that. And I see so many people doing that, and those fish spook so easy. And now with forward facing sonar, you pull up on a spot and you see those fish, you don't even get a cast at them sometimes, and they are gone. And it's so hard to get into people's head that you have to fish it differently here. You absolutely have to keep your distance from any type of structure, weeds, any of it, because if those fish are sitting tight to that outside edge of the weeds and you're within half a casting distance of it, there's a good chance you're going to spook that fish, or by the time you make 2 or 3 casts, that fish is retreated back into the weeds as opposed to coming out.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It's interesting to kind of tie it back into my comment earlier on waypointing and everything. I started doing that this year, especially in like the mid afternoon when it was super flat, super calm, like just the worst conditions. You don't want to beat your head against the wall. You want to save yourself for last light, especially on Eagle, which is a notorious afternoon into dark bite. I started doing more of that mapping on new stuff during that time period because the previous 2 years I would try and fish through it. And I don't run live scope or live imaging in my boat. I maybe should up there to see out ahead of the boat to make sure I'm not going to run up on spots. 360 would be another good tool for that, but I just don't run it. It's not my style. And what would happen the last 2 years is I'd just roll up on the structure because I didn't know it was there because there's no lake maps, right? So this year I spent more of that time mapping it so I could fish it more effectively. And to your point, like it's all about boat positioning up there 100% of the time. And the interesting thing is, like, while your boat may be sitting in 40 or 80 feet of water, depending on how steep the break is, you can throw a blade right over the top of that, and those fish will come up from 20 feet down and check it out. I've had it happen a million different times up there. I've gotten fish to eat doing that. So don't think because it's deep, you have to change the tool you're using necessarily, especially in the clear basins. Obviously, yeah, if you want to work a tube down the break or a crankbait and run it deep or something like that, that's an effective tool to hit those deeper breaks. But you can throw a blade just about as effectively over the top of it, and they'll come up and check it out. You just got to make sure you're exaggerating those eights and giving them time to swim up from the bottom and start that chase process. And I think that's what a lot of guys struggle with is they'll go to pull the blades out off those deeper breaks, and then the fish shows itself, and you never gave it that time to come up from deep and engage on that bait near the boat. So it's one of those things where, yeah, stay off that structure. Like if you watch my videos, if I'm fishing where my bait can touch the shore, there's a reason for that. And if I'm fishing where my bait is nowhere near the shore, there's a reason for that too. And like when you and I fish, Glenn, there's that one kind of mid lake rock we fished that night, and I raised one fish off it the whole time I was up there. It's a community spot for sure. And when I rolled up on it, I'm like, I just never know how far to stay off of this rock because you feel like you want your blades to, or whatever you're throwing, to touch the rock and be up real tight to it, but not necessarily. And usually when I see fish off that spot, they're not super tight to the structure. They're off that deeper break. And it's just a good reminder that take the deeper pass, especially if it's a smaller spot or in a shorter run, take the deeper pass and then work your way in to avoid spooking those fish up there. And you'll most likely have better success doing that, to your point.
Yeah, I agree. And I use the forward facing sonar basically like a live side imaging. And to your point about running perspective forward to see what there is for structure, and then the forward just looking at kind of the shoreline. We're predominantly shoreline and structure fishermen, but using it that way, I can keep myself off as far as I need to without getting close to those breaks. And I have a video with my buddy Tony and Carl, and it's not from Eagle, it's from another lake. And we had fished through a spot earlier in the day. We were having a tough day, and we were seeing fish and moving fish. We weren't getting anywhere close to shore with our cast. We were a casting distance from shore, boat sitting in 35, 40 feet of water, and those fish are sitting in that classic anywhere suspended from 12 to 20, 25 feet. They were sitting suspended in there. And we were able to move those fish on bucktails, on suics, on rubber. Of course, rubbery, we can get down to them a little bit deeper, but those fish were coming up to intercept the bait. We had fished the shoreline, moved some fish. We went out to a mid lake reef. And again, I'm sitting way off of it. Like we're not even, I don't even want to hit the top of it. yeah, there might be fish up there, but if we don't see them on the deep, I'll move up and we'll cast shallow after. And I ended up getting a really nice tiger. We went back to that other piece of shoreline, and in my video, it's almost like a rookie mistake. I pull in with the tube, I get the tube up, and I just do this really big lazy 8 behind the motor because I fish from the back of the boat like a lot of us. And that fish comes up from underneath the boat and crushes the tube. And a lot of people, they come to Canada and they rip rubber. As soon as they get it to the boat, they do like the Doug Wagner up rip, and then they just take it out of the water. And yeah, sometimes you'll get those fish that'll hit on that up rip, but yeah, you got to give them time to connect with the bait up here. And it's such a hard mindset shift to make, to give them, especially with rubber baits and especially with like a Suick or any type of dive and rise. You have to give them that split second to connect with the bait.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And one of the big keys to our success was running a Suick off the back of the boat, because when I'd get it 10 to 20 feet out, I'd let it death rise and I weight my Suicks a little bit more heavily. I'd pull one out here. I'm in the boat right now. I'd pull one out, but I got a bunch of sucker rigging stuff in the way. But on that death rise, everybody's always wondering, like, what do you do with the Suick at the boat, right? And on these shield fish in particular, that death rise is so important, because if they pop on that bait, to your point, chances are they're hot, right? So as soon as it death rises and you can see it, they're on it. You bring that bait in and you work it just like a bucktail. Hang it in the corner, bring it in. But to tie back into your thought, sometimes they don't always show right away. And it will literally take until that bait's just about to the surface on that death rise, and then they'll come up behind it like this. And that's when you jerk it at the boat, and you don't treat it like a bucktail, and you snap it and you try to keep it down. And one of the big keys to our success up there this year, as folks will see in the video series, is when the bait would come within 2 feet of the surface on that death rise, they'd lose all of it. So I hit it not slightly rise, but I could get it to that point and continue to jerk it erratically below that 2-foot line. For whatever reason, that 2-foot line was like the off limits line for them. They wanted nothing to do with it. But if I could keep it there, I could trigger them at the boat doing that approach. And I don't even know how many we caught at the boat on a Suick. A lot more than we have in the past up there for sure. But that was kind of the key to it. But the whole point of that being is, up there you have to give them time. And you hear people talk about slow down, slow down, slow down, especially with jerk baits. Like, it's super important up there, especially off the deeper breaks that you alluded to give them that time to come up and find the bait. And it's so different. I was up fishing before the battle with Gus and Max Manti a little bit, and we're fishing Wisconsin fish on lakes that set up somewhat similar to shield structure in terms of long underwater points and stuff like that. And the interesting thing about Wisconsin fish compared to like shield lake fish that I've noticed over the years is Wisconsin fish are like, you bring it right by their head and they're gonna jump on it, which is why Medusas and rubber baits rip through the weeds are so effective, because those fish will bury in the weeds, and as soon as you rip it by them, you get that reaction bite. What's so different about shield fish is they're naturally reproducing, which makes them more intelligent than stock fish, and they like to chase. They like to hunt their prey. They don't ambush, they hunt it. And at least this is my takeaway over the years. So you have to give them that time, especially when they're positioned deeper, to come up and find it, and give them that opportunity to chase the bait in order to convert them at the boat or out on some sort of mid-cast trigger type event. So it's important to slow down and kind of know your tools and take some of that into consideration if you're going to go up to the shield.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, Dirk, I see you there. And he is from overseas, so it's cool to see him joining us here. We had a couple minutes left here, Kyle. We're going to run into a little bit of overtime on the first episode because we had a little bit of a glitch getting going. So I do apologize for the people that are watching live and the people that are going to watch later that we were a little bit late getting going. But I wanted kind of segue into the sucker fishing. We're just getting ready to kind of wrap up our season here. I'm going to head out this weekend, probably hit Eagle either Saturday or Sunday, probably hit one of the other lakes the other day. And then the following weekends, it's weather dependent on what we can do up here. Like winter's going to come. It does every year. But we, to your point about the hunting and the following and the way that fish react up here, this is the first year I've really ran the forward facing sonar sucker rigging, and it was a continuation of the hard summer, and the bite windows were like just super tight. And you and I talk about it all the time. I send you pictures every day we were out, that it was like nothing for 3 hours, and then we get three fish in 45 minutes, and there's no rhyme or reason. And I think we had 6 days where we got three fish every day, and one day where we got two, and then we got skunked on our last day out. But we had a weird weather event there too. So there's a lot of reasons why that could have happened. But probably between 50 and 75% of the time we had a sucker in the water, there was a muskie or multiple muskies following. And with the live scope, it's so interesting. You're moving along. We move zero 0.5 to 0.9 of a mile an hour, and we run two suckers. We're only allowed one rod in Ontario each. We don't cast. If we have three people in the boat, sometimes one of us, there's our timer. If there's three people in the boat, sometimes one of us will cast, but primarily we just run suckers. So we're running suckers and we're seeing muskies just follow up and down, and we raise the sucker up, we put it down. Dave puts his at 20 feet down and just leaves it. We do everything. And what we've seen is that we'll get close to a break line. And I talk about like that Steve Herbeck vertical lines in the water where that hard bedrock meets the sand bottom. It can be 50 feet deep, and those fish are sitting at 20 or 30, and we get a sucker over there 20 feet down, and that fish just comes. And what we were seeing this fall, more than I think in the past, again, I didn't have live. We ran it a little bit last year. We didn't really have suckers, so it was a bad baseline. But we would have those fish that would babysit that sucker for 15, 20 minutes. We'd get close to a break line, and all of a sudden a fish would come off of that break line and just make a beeline for the sucker. And if they went straight in, they would grab it, and there was no setting the hook. Like, they were dragging line out. Anybody that's watched my video with my buddy Craig, we were set up like 2 minutes. He puts a sucker down. He's like, I think I got one. It's just peeling line. I'm like, stop it and see if it's a fish. So we see different kind of behaviors of different styles of fish. And it seems that the aggressive fish that shoot in quickly, get right on that sucker, they mean business. The ones that just kind of, they slowly come off the bottom. And Dave and I were talking, we look back on the summer when we have that lazy deep follow on live scope that stops 20 feet from the boat. You could cast at that fish all freaking day. It's not eating. I don't care what people say about you're going to catch that fish with live scope. You're going to harass it all day. That shit just don't happen. You got one or two chances at a fish up here on Shield Lakes, and that fish is not going to eat. Maybe you're snagging it, or maybe you're getting like a crazy reaction bite, but 9.9 times out of 10, you get like one shot at these things. And same thing we're seeing with the suckers. You get those suckers by them, and if they don't hit right away, you might as well just keep moving and not even worry about it. Like Dave, the one video, I'm like, oh, Dave, you got one on you. I think I'm talking to Kyle on the phone. Dave's like, I'll tell you when I have one. Like, stop telling me what you see on the freaking screen, because it does get frustrating. And that's the flip side of the electronics and all this stuff that goes with it, is that it's fun to watch. Like, there's no doubt, watching the interaction, it feels intimate. It feels like, okay, what do I got to do to get this fish to eat? And I know there's lots of people that see it completely opposite, but when you're sucker rigging, it's like, okay, I need to jig it away from them like you do with a walleye. I need to do something different like a trout. Muskies are just different, man. They just do musky things, and their mood changes on where they are in the water column. We've seen fish come from 35 feet up to hit a sucker 5 feet under the water. We've brought a sucker down to 35 feet and had a fish hit it at the bottom. I mean, they do such weird things, but for us this year, our sucker season, while it was successful and we were averaging 3 fish a day, which is great by any standards, it was, it some days felt poor for us because we were used to 4 to 8, 4 to 9, 4 to 10 fish days being pretty common. And this year, like I said, it was that extension of this tough summer, tough, early fall, tough fall, and then just tough into that sucker bite. And I hear, like, I was talking with Gus and Max, and they were seeing the same things that week that we were catching all the fish. Like, they would have those tight little bite windows. And I think we'll come back on and do this another time, Kyle, because I think you and I got some ideas on why things were the way they were. But it is interesting that for us that those hard bite windows seem to last the whole year.
I think that's it's probably a byproduct of pressure, but yeah, that's certainly more common in the fall where, man, it seems like you wait all day and then you get a window where you have 2 or 3 opportunities and then you're done. But I do have I'll send you a trick, Glenn, on getting those lazy followers to actually convert on a sucker rig. I've shared it with like 4 people. It's a trick that got the fish that would have won the muskie battle to bite. That fish was not going to bite the sucker. We got it to bite the sucker. I'm not going to give it away yet because it's almost too good at this point. In terms of success rate, I'll send it to you, and I'll be curious if it works up there like it does down here with what I do to convert those lazy sucker fish. But I think that's pretty typical though. Like what most people are seeing with running the live. I run the live when I drag suckers more for entertainment purposes because I have a strict like no casting after November rule in my boat because I want to enjoy catching a muskie versus wearing myself out doing it like all year, So, but yeah, that's pretty typical. Usually, if they shoot in, either they'll crush the sucker, I'll never even see them on live, or they'll come in hot, they'll eat it right away, or they're gonna follow, and then you have to try and convert them with the technique. But yeah, I'd say that's pretty typical. But I think pressure is probably leading to some of this because the reality is there's that old saying like even bad pizza is pretty good, right? Like the reality today is with electronics and stuff, like even the bad pressure is still pretty good on these fish. And up in your neck of the woods, I would agree. I thought Eagle was very heavily pressured, especially Portage Bay. When I was up there, I could not believe the amount of, one guy running the transducer pole, another guy standing there with a bulldog over his shoulder, and they're shining scope on deep reefs and stuff up there. Like it was all over the place up there. And even when you got outside of those deeper trophy basins and stuff, like there was boats all over the place for the most part. So it's one of those things where it seems like some of that pressure is maybe get into some of these fish, even on lakes like an Eagle Lake, which is a large body of water. You hear about Lake of the Woods being down this year, and maybe we're wrong with the pressure thing. Maybe it was just lack of snowfall. A mild winter had these fish in a funk. We never really got that warm up in June that you normally get, it seems like this year. So maybe that played into it, but it's hard to deny that when fish are pressured, it wouldn't impact them, especially when there's been studies of, fish that have tags in them that were caught on a spot and then never visited that spot again their entire life, as long as the tag was in the fish. Like there's been many studies that have those sorts of results. So it'll be interesting to see, over the next few years, does it get worse or do we have a bounce back year in here? And kind of makes you like, where do they go? When they're getting.
Sorry to cut in. I just wanted to touch on the tagging thing. We tagged some fish up with long-legged when I had first met Kyla and her family, and we caught some of the same fish on almost the exact same spots. And this year, the amount of tigers that we've caught in the past on the exact same spot, and again, you and I have talked about the difference of Canadian shield fish versus those Wisconsin and Minnesota fish. Let's not dive into that today. I want to cut this off right away here. But these are the subjects that we're going to talk about in these little 54 minutes live. And I'm going to warn people, or maybe they'll be happy. Kyle's going to be a pretty regular guest here because we talk a lot anyway. So we might as well do it here where we can get some interaction with people. We'll do a better job of letting people know when we're going to come on and have some of these discussions. I'm going to try and bring some other guests on that, we'll talk about the science of it. We'll talk about, the guide life of it, stuff like that. But I want to leave with, I see James had a question. A new angler, what do you believe is the best lure to give that pause that you talked about? So like that death pause. It's for me, we've always been big Suick users, and we kind of got away from them with this boom of boutique baits. Everybody builds a glide bait and everybody seems to build a dive and rise. And no lie, we had awesome success with the dipstick from Top Line, and that's still, that bait works. But this year, the pressure that these fish were seeing up here, and just the multitude of baits, it seemed like going back to like a classic Suick. And for a lot of people, the 9-inch wooden weighted Suick is, it's easy to throw. You don't have to do anything real crazy with it. They just fricking work. Sometimes you have to go through 2 or 3 to get that one that has that right neutral balance, or some guys like the nose down, some like the tail down. You got to find what you like in it, but it's really hard to go wrong with a Suick. And for me, the other one that I would say, it's easy to say the pit bull this year was kind of that answer on a pull pause. You can let it hang style of bait, and that worked everywhere. I mean, it worked for us, but I don't know how tubes are still underutilized by so many people. I know they don't fricking look like much. Like I was messing with some tubes here earlier, and they just don't look like anything, but they fricking flat out catch fish. And you can, for a lot of new anglers like yourself, James, or your wife, Karen, a 9-inch or a 7-inch Ninja tube, just a naked tube, no blade on it, no nothing. It almost acts like a glide bait. It almost acts like a Suick in that dive and rise. You can do a lot with it. So like those would be my 3 suggestions. What would you say, Kyle, for that style of bait?
It's hard to argue with your picks. I mean, obviously, I'll gravitate towards the Suick because I don't think you can work it wrong. There's obviously an art, specifically boat side with it, and a lot of that you'll pick up over time with interactions on fish. So a dive and rise like a Suick, the tube is obviously a good one. The key to it is kind of that, at least from what I saw this year, was the actual rise motion to it. So I would throw in a crankbait, whether that's a 9-inch grandma, 10-inch Jake, something like that, depending, like a tighter wobble versus that more wandering approach like a Jake has. Um, those would be good options for that. And then, a bait that's not throwing a ton is, and I actually don't even think I have one in the boat, to be honest with you, anymore. But the dying dog would be another good option where you got that kind of rubber style jerk bait that has a rise to it.
I think
The fish are, while you're looking for that, Glenn, the fish are, they're going to tell you what they want, whether they want the falling action or they want that rising action or they want, a fleeing approach. Like when you guys think about baits, and like I'm no expert when I'm saying this, but this is just stuff I've picked up over the years. Bucktail emulates a fleeing bait fish, and that'll make fish hot. A wounded bait fish is a Suick will emulate that very well. A crankbait emulates a combination of fleeing and feeding bait fish. So depending on what the fish are keying in on, and that can be seasonally dependent depending on what the bait fish are doing in your body of water, which is why it's important to understand that primary forage base. Like Green Bay is a great example of that. And I saw Bob Parteka was in here commenting a little bit earlier. Like those fish are so keyed in on the perch that, folks are basically trawling 12 super shad wraps at any given point in time out there, depending on the time of year. So the fish are going to tell you what they want. And I would say to just keep an open mind. Like, don't, just because you caught a fish the day prior on a pit bull or tube or Suick, don't let that lock you into that's the pattern. That could have just been reaction by circumstance. Let the fish kind of tell you what is making them chase and what they actually want, I think. Oh, Glenn, I think we lost you, your audio. There.
Got me?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I think I pulled it out when I was looking for that dying dog. It's put away, but the dying dog, I always put a weight on the front hook hanger so it gets more of that drop. But I'll leave it at think simplicity for new anglers like James and his wife Karen. You don't want to overwhelm new anglers with stuff that's either hard to throw or hard to work. So I know crankbaits work, but for some people, that's a tough thing to just keep cranking in a crankbait all day. And it's even tougher if you're going to do like the pull kind of maneuver with like a ridgeway. Like it takes a bit of work. That's where like something like a pit bull is really cool because you don't have to do a whole bunch with it. It's light enough. But I would just people go back to those simple Suicks. And Kyle's going to have a really cool segment on one of his upcoming videos, how he mods it. We've kind of modded our Suics very similar over the years, short of moving the hook quite like Kyle does. And I did what I call the Friedges mod to mine this year and had success right away. And I had my weight slightly different than Kyle, but again, it's preference. But I think there's things that you can do with those simple lures, and it doesn't always have to be $150 boutique bait that's going to work for you. And I just think, again, to maybe kind of wrap this right up, Kyle, it's so easy in this industry to think that you have to have the latest, the greatest, the best to work. And somehow a lure like the Suick is coming back into fashion because of guys like you. And having somebody like you on the Suick team is only going to be good for a brand like Suick because now it's a new generation of Suick users, and you're vocal in how you use it, how you're modding it. I think that's awesome for a lot of these companies to have that newer generation of angler out there using some of these classic lures.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the Suick thing, it's just such an easy brand to get behind and such a great lure to use. And I was just going to give James this piece of advice here. I don't know if you guys will be able to see that well, but they're just bell sinkers. I think this one is 3/8 ounce. Um, what I like to do, James, like if you buy a 9 or a 10-inch weighted woods, I generally prefer the wood ones over the plastic personally, but that's because I like to tinker with them and stuff, and it's a little easier to do that when the wood is bent, buoyant versus plastic, which is hollow. You can add these weights to the front of your Suick very easily on that front hook hanger, just like Glenn is showing you there. Um, so if that bait's rising too fast at the boat and the fish are disinterested, add a little weight and allow it to suspend a little bit more, and play around with the where you place that weight. You can add it to the back hook hanger too. Some of my best Suicks have a tail down rise to them, and when you think about a wounded bait fish, oftentimes they have fin damage on one side or another. They're sitting on their side and they're kicking like this, and they bounce back up. They kick and they bounce back up, and depending on what the muskies want, they may want a faster rise shop. You can buy off Amazon probably too. Um, this will give you more versatility with that same bait, and all it takes is a split ring and one of these, and you can add more. Oftentimes, I'll add 2 or 3 of these to the front. I really like adding just one to the front of a Suick because when you want just a little bit more weight and more of a suspending action, because that depending on how you pull it, it'll kind of slide to one side or the other of the hook hanger, and then it'll make that bait kind of pull like this a little bit and give you more of that wandering action. So play around with it and give it a shot. And you can add bell sinkers to a lot of baits, whether that's rubber baits or crank baits or even bucktails. Add them to bucktails sometimes too if you want to get that bait a little bit further down the water column and don't want to have to count it down as long. It can be an effective way to do that too.
Yeah, absolutely. What I will suggest is after Kyle drops his Eagle Lake series where he talks about the Suick mods, let's get back together, Kyle, do this. We'll have a couple things in front of us that we can show the viewers. I'll show them how I modded mine, what we've done in the past, and you can show us your stuff. We'll kind of share between our audiences. I just think that's just a valuable way to try and get that information out there. I don't like hiding a lot of stuff. Yeah, there's a couple mods we all do to different things that you kind of keep, tight to the chest. But for the most part, we want everybody to succeed when they're out there. So I think that would be great. And let's just wrap it up there, Kyle. I appreciate you, giving the time, and I apologize to the viewers for the little bit of the delay at the beginning. We had to get Kyle hooked up there, and this is new to me too. So it's going to be a work in progress, but I do hope that when I do more stuff like this, you guys will tune in. I'm hoping to have some really cool guests, and I will have Kyle back on because I think, again, Kyle and I talk a lot, so we might as well do this in a public fashion so that we can get those interactions. I just think, again, it's the community building. So thank you so much, Kyle.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Glenn. And I see, is that Dirk, I think?
Yep.
Just kind of, yeah, Dirk, I do have a channel. It was previously called Cabbage Dragon Media. At the beginning of this, we touched on a recent rebrand we did. So you can search Cabbage Dragon Media, or Beyond the Eight is the new brand name of it now. So we'll be a little tied up with Wisconsin Rifle over the next couple weeks here. And then once I get done with that and we transition to December, I'll really be pumping out the content at that point. Life's just been too busy for me to have any sort of success in terms of video editing. So there's a lot of good stuff to come. Some pretty cool adventures my wife and I went on too, and the Musky battle video will probably be the next video that I do drop in early December. So a lot to look forward to there. And yeah, thanks for having me, Glenn. This was fun. I can sit here and talk muskies, and it's even more fun being in the boat and having some of this stuff right at my disposal here to show these guys. So
yeah, so next time we get on, we'll touch on the battle. I know we didn't do that too much, and we'll discuss, some of these lure mods and etc. There. See, our buddy Kevin Wagner just popped in, and I appreciate all the help Kevin's given me, and I know he's given you a little bit over the year here too. So nice to see him there. But really appreciate it. I appreciate our joint community kind of joining in with us. So until next time, 54 Bust and Beyond the Eight, we're out of here. We'll catch you guys out on the water.